Good morning, dearest friends. A guten Erev Shabbos. It's Friday, the 16th of Tammuz, July 15th. Yes, tomorrow will be Shiva Asur B'Tammuz, the 17th of Tammuz, but because it's Shabbos, it'll be a nitcha. The fast will be deferred to Sunday, Be'ezra Hashem, which is good news for those that need some leniencies in their fasting regimen, but that's for your local Orthodox rabbi. It's a fast. It's a sad day. It begins the 3 weeks. But in times of sadness, Jewish people, we tap in, we plug in to the joy that Torah gives. And so we're going to learn some Gemara. We're learning the entire Talmud, one page, one line at a time. Right now, we are studying Masechet Shabbat, and we are, with Hashem's help, at the tail end of the 17th chapter, Perek Kol HaKelim. We talked about broken vessel parts and handles and components, detached, reattached, de novo attached. And now we got into a little bit of a specific discussion, which we are comparing and contrasting shutters, pekaks, which is the discussion the Mishnah mentions, a pekak that goes into the window. Is it hanging? Is it tied? Is it tied, not hanging? Is it loose? And the Gemara, for reference, compares it to the halachis of, and to a Mishnah that talks about a nagar, which is the bolt, not the bolt, the piece of wood that goes into lock a door. So you have two bolts. This is the olden, I guess you could do it today too, but the old-fashioned way of securing a door. And that too was an item that could be detached, nominally attached, fully attached. And so that's going to be the comparison. And that's going to be the bulk of the part of the Gemara that we're studying today, where we left off yesterday. Let's share the screen, and then we can get started. I'm going to share the screen so that I can show you this. So this is from Aldaf, different images that are connected to our Gemara. And I wanted to show you, well, this we already know about. And then this, in case you needed a picture to envision what it looks like, this would be approximately what the nagar would look like. Now let's see the Gemara. So here we go. Amar Rabbi Abba, Amar Rabbi Kahana. So I'm sorry, let's go back to the Mishnah just for a moment. The Mishnah says that the shutter, the Tanakama says it must be taloi v'kasher or kasher v'taloi, hanging and tied. The Chachamim say no, you can use it regardless. Bein kach u bein kach. So what are the two scenarios of bein kach u bein kach? Are they the two more lenient scenarios or the two more strict scenarios? So Rav Kana says what it means is bein kosher, bein she'eini kosher. So long as it is not muksa, it is mizuma, it is prepared, and we even read in Tosfos that it means mentally. But imagine it doesn't mean mentally. Let's say Reb Beryl was actually fashioned, and it's really compatible with window shuttering. So then the Chachamim say bein kosher, bein she'eini kosher. Rav Yirmiyah says, hold on. Why do you rush to give the most lenient interpretation to the Chachamim? Maybe it needs to be tied. And the bein kach or bein kach, whether like this or whether like that, is saying bein taloi, bein she'eini taloi. It could be taut, it could be loose, so long as it's tied. So basically, Rav Kana gives an interpretation that conveys the most lenient possible scenario. Bein kach or bein. Actually, this picture does a good job showing it. Dr. Stamler, you see my screen now? I got on the phone, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So here,
Yes, I
we
do.
have the three scenarios depicted. Kasher v'taloi, here you see it's dangling, it's hanging. Kasher, it's tied, ve'enoi taloi. And enoi kasher, ve'enoi taloi. It is neither tied nor dangling. So we could circle any two of these. Let me see. We could say these two. That's what Rav Yirmiyah wants to say, the two more strict. But Rav Kana says it's these two. Two more lenient in a bein kach or bein kach, inclusive of even a totally detached thing. So the shaila in the Gemara now is why Paskin like Rav Kana to be more lenient? Rav Yirmiyah wants to be a little more strict, a little more restrictive.
Anybody asking you?
That's the question.
You have background noise.
Hold on. Dr. Pasternak. Good morning and good Erev Shabbos.
Good.
How are you? Did you raise your hand, or that was just the button you pressed?
No, I'm trying to get rid of it.
All right, no worries. I think I can get rid of it. There, I got rid of it.
Okay,
Doctor, it's good to see you.
good.
And Mrs. Pasternak, good to see you too. All right. So here is the Gemara's question. And just to make Rebel happy, I'm going to hit mute all, and then we'll invite everyone to unmute. Here we go. Homily Rav Yirmiyah, V'lei Mamar. Rav Yirmiyah asks, he challenges the viewpoint conveyed to us by Rabbi Abba, originally the teaching of Rav Kana. V'lei Mamar bein toloi bein she'eino toloi. Why don't you instead give the more restrictive interpretation? V'hu shekasher, it needs to be tied. Why would he be inclined to give a more restrictive interpretation? It's because of the Mishnah we're about to read about a bolt, a neger hanigrar. Let's take a look. The Amar Rabba bar Rav Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. We have a teaching exactly about our scenario of the pekak. And Rabba bar Rav Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan said, "Kamachloikes kan, kach machloikes neger hanigrar." A dragging bolt has the same halacha as the pekak. What's the halacha of the neger hanigrar? I just want to say, when I'm using the nekudas that are provided by Rabbi Steinsaltz, and I guess I'll make that disclaimer for the future. People are watching, they're wondering that there's a Hebrew word that could sound like an offensive English word, but obviously there's zero correlation. I'm going to defer to Rabbi Steinsaltz's nekudas here. Neger hanigrar noyalam by b'mikdash, a dragging bolt. You can use it in the Beis Hamikdash, avaloi b'mdina, but not outside of the Beis Hamikdash. But here is the punchline for our purposes: v'hamonach. If it's laying, it's dragging, it's not hanging, and it's not only not hanging. Rashi says it's laying v'einoi kosher klal. It's not at all tied. Kan v'kanoser, it is universally prohibited. Yehuda says hamunach b'mikdash v'hanigrar b'medina. Yehuda says no, in the Beis Hamikdash, even if it is untied, but universally it needs to be tied, affixed, dragging. Something that's dragging is tied on one end. Rashi hanigrar can the mefarish a kosher bedeles. It's attached to the door. Elo sheroisha nigrar la'aretz. So imagine you have a bolt that needs to go into the lock, but you have a chain that keeps it affixed. Kind of like, although not entirely like, we have in the hotels those little chain locks where you slip it into the hole, so it could dangle loose, but it's attached to the door. Obviously, here we're talking about a big heavy bolt, and we're talking about that it's attached to the property, to the structure. But the bottom line that is born out of this machlokes here is that it must be attached to be allowed to be used on Shabbos, which would make us understand clearly, and this is what Rav Yirmiyah is asking. Based on this, we need to interpret our Mishnah. Bein kach u bein kach. It must be tied, but maybe it's not tali. Vitanya, why? Okay, Dr. Hammer, go ahead. Doctor, you're muted. So
I'm trying to understand the underlying reason why in terms of the muktzah, and why, for example, have a shutter and it starts raining. Is there anything that's acceptable from inside that you could put to keep the rain from coming into the room? Whether it's a curtain, a piece of something solid, whatever, This sort of goes back to this concept of this functional fixedness, which I think is embedded in all of these rules. Because I was thinking yesterday, if I may digress just for a moment, about kalim. In the old days, children would play with their mother's pots and pans, little kids.
Doctor, you hit mute by mistake, I think.
I don't know
Go
where
ahead. Children would play with their parents' pots and pans.
pots and pans, okay? And as a result, those were their quote toys,
Right.
whatever you labeled them.
So
okay?
I'm glad you asked this.
What I'm saying is whether it's that kind of play or go out and play basketball
Mhm.
today, everything has to be labeled.
Yeah.
Okay. And this is the same thing here. We have to label something a shutter, a permanent shutter, or a non-permanent shutter. And I just
Dr. Hammer,
well,
I want to translate what you're saying. What you're saying is, Rabbi Label, you did not explain this Gemara well. No, that's not what you're trying to say. But I failed to make an important clarification before we started. So I'm glad you asked that. The doctor's on the phone. All right. So I'm going to say it now, and when the doctor gets back on, I'll clarify it. Here we're not. Oh, here, doctor. This case of the pikak, the shutter, and the neger and the post is not a muksa conversation anymore.
Oh.
It's a question more of construction on Shabbos.
Okay.
So muksa is a secondary issue. So talking about muksa is accurate because the Gemara said bilvad. What was the language? V'husham is sukkah. It has to be not muksa. But the primary issue here is not about it's not being muksa. The primary question is, at what point is it considered a kind of structural enhancement that's not considered problematic on Shabbos? Because outright binyan to really build is totally unacceptable. As you recall, Rashi explained the difference between an ohel that's being further extended versus a new ohel. And so similarly, to attach something, even if it's temporary, but if it's a part of the building, is that considered a problematic kind of construction? And so the machloikes really is, does it need to just be it doesn't need to be, could you just pop it in even if it wasn't attached? Or does it need to be attached by being tied? Or does it need to actually be hanging on the building? So it's really already dependent in the greatest sense on the structure. And so here, that's our question. What kind of structural modification can transpire on Shabbos?
Rabbi.
The question which I'm not yet answering, and we need to revisit, and until that question is answered, I think it will not be fully gishmak, will not be fully comfortable, is what exactly is the essence of the debate, if it's tied or if it's hanging. Is there like a deep thematic challenge, or is it just that the building is already built and the hole is already there, and and it's obvious that you're going to be putting this thing in, and it's temporary, and so therefore we don't see that as construction, versus no, it actually already needs to be fused to the building in some sense? Or is there some kind of deeper underlying debate? That's the question that's going to remain out for the jury to decide, not to decide, but it's going to remain there for us to explore. Right now, we're comparing two scenarios for the simple sense of how connected or not connected is a utility for the building when it's not attached physically. Is it conceptually attached? Is it present? And so that's the debate. And that's why we bring the analogy of the board that goes into the window, or the shutter that goes into the window, and a bolt which goes into lock the door. It's part of how the door functions, but it's not installed, or it's not fully installed. That, I believe, is the essential debate. Now, doctor, the reason why you asked that question, and we might say that I needed to clarify that, is because the Mishnah does something curious here. The Mishnah has three scenarios: scenario A, scenario B, and scenario C. The first scenario was, let me see if I can remember, the rock in the pitcher, and the rock is there. The second scenario is the vine attached to the pitcher. And it was a question of, is the rock muksa, is the vine muksa? And then we talk about a pikak, we talk about a window shutter. And you would think, and this is, I was listening to a podcast about intellectual IQ tests and stuff. And so one of the things that humans are better than computers at is creating patterns, because there's sometimes a kind of finesse that's not entirely on paper, but you can get a sense of a pattern. And so we naturally pick up the pattern, muksa. So of course the third item should be muksa, but it's not. It's an issue of construction. So then what is the common pattern that makes these all to be in the same Mishnah? And that's a curiosity of this Mishnah. The answer, I would say, is we're talking about the permissibility of things that are attached or nominally related to the thing that it works with. In two cases, the issue is muksa, and in one case, the issue is more about a boina kind of question. But
Rabbi,
the question that Dr. Hammer asked in one way is the question I think that anybody that explores this more is going to ask, which is, hold on, how do we just go from muksa to something else? Reb Beryl, I hope I addressed the question at least enough that we'll be able to look out for the remaining details. Reb Beryl, go ahead.
all the examples we have is where the item is outside the house. What if, does it make a difference if the shutter and the bolt and the piece of wood is inside the house?
I don't know. My assumption is the bolt is on the inside of the house. My assumption even is that the shutter might be on the inside of the house. You're going to ask me a question from these pictures. I think it's easier to portray a house and you'll know exactly the context if it's on the outside, because then you can draw the house with the roof and then show all the details. If it would be on the inside, it would be a harder image to portray. I'm not certain that this is dafke on the exterior. I think it could be in any.
So it's not relevant whether it's inside or outside.
I don't believe so. But I'm open to revising my impression. But at this point, my sense is that it would not be relevant exactly where its placement in the structure is.
Oh, I thought halachically, because the construction presumes from outside, maybe inside you wouldn't consider it construction. Anyway.
Right.
Okay.
So for the purposes of baina construction, we wouldn't differentiate between inside and outside, both to have something be prohibited if it was really baina. I'll explain to you I'm going to tease you just one more time. The reason why this Gemara is confusing is because we're not really talking about, as Rashi made the case, we're really not talking about baina deraisa. We're not talking about a biblical kind of construction. We're talking about something that maybe is a derabanan. The Rabbanan themselves created some guidelines or restrictions for exactly when and how it can and can't be deployed. And that's exactly the nature of our debate, of our question over here. So we have a Mishnah. One rabbi, the Tanakama, says, Taloi v'kosher, it needs to be tied and hanging really tightly attached. The Chacham retorts, Ben kach u'ben kach. No, we are much more permissive. Either case, it's okay. But the problem is when you say either and you have three options, that gets confusing. Which two are we referring to when we say either? And so, Rav Kana has one interpretation, and Rav Yirmiyah is vigorously pushing back at him. On what basis is he pushing back? Well, first he quotes Rav Yochanan. Rav Yochanan drew a correlation between the case of the shutter and a bolt. And the bolt, we know clearly it's talking about that it is attached. And so Rav Yochanan, Rav Kahana, Rav Abba, or Rav Abba, Rav Kana, is now pretty in a tight spot. Let's see if Rav Abba and Rav Kana is going to be able to get themselves out of the tight spot. But we're not done yet. We need to add one more clarifying brisa, which fills in the gaps and makes us realize what kind of good question the bolt question is to the door. Vitanya, a brisa that elaborates more on the halacha of the bolts. What is the kind of bolt that we would be allowed to use in the Beis Hamikdash, but not outside? We're describing dafka, a kind of bolt which is tied and hanging, but it's dangling on the floor. And even there, the Tanakama says only in the Beis Hamikdash it would be okay, but not in the rest of the land. This sounds very closely to the Tanakama of our Mishnah, who says kosher v'talei. Rabbi Huda disagrees. Rabbi Huda Omer, ze apim dina mutar. Even anywhere, if it's kosher, it's tied, but dangling, you're allowed to. What is prohibited? An entirely detached bolt. This brisa, which elucidates, clarifies the Mishnah about the bolt, makes it clear that if this case is very, very reminiscent of Yirmiya's interpretation. Bein kach u bein kach means the two stricter scenarios, and nobody agrees on the most lenient scenario that it's not tied nor hanging, seeming to put Rav Kahana in a very tough spot. Let's see how they'll defend themselves. Actually, no, one more line. The Amar Rabbi Shua ben Abba Mishmei the Ula, and Rabbi Shua ben Abba says, "Man Tana Negar Hanigar Rabbi Lazari." That indeed, the author of this Mishnah follows Rabbi Lazar, who rings true, who connects to our Mishnah. Amar Rabbi Lazar is the one in our Mishnah. Basically, it's clear, there's a clear alignment between our Mishnah, the Pekak, the Shutter, and the other Mishnah that talks about the bolt. This is a very strong and profoundly damaging challenge to the opinion of Amar Rav Abba, Amar Rav Kahana. How are they going to defend themselves? How will they push back? Will they reassert their interpretation, or will they revise and amend based on Rav Yirmiya's challenge? Omar le Abaye, I'm saying not Abaye. Rav Abba, who's the one? Rav Abba quotes Rav Kahana, says, "Ano Damri, you're making a mistake. When I say that the Mishnah allows for something to be untied and unhanging and untied, ki haitana detanya, I'm actually basing my interpretation on another brisa, which says like this: Kana sheiskina balabayis liya is poiseach v'noyal boy. If a person made a reed, fixed it up to be as a bolt, bizman shekasher v'tolei b'pesach, when it is tied and hanging, poiseach v'noyal boy, you can use it. This sounds like our Tanakama, who says it needs to be kasher v'tolei. Ein kasher v'tolei, but if it is not tied and hanging, ein poiseach v'noyal boy, you cannot use it. That's the first opinion, sounding like our Mishnah is Tanakama. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel has a different take. He says, Misukan, if it is designated, if it is intended to be a bolt, af al pi she'enoi kosher, it needn't be tied at all. Consistent of Rav Yirmiya's interpretation of the second opinion in the Mishnah. So let me just give a fast recap. We have a Mishnah that was somewhat vague in the opinion of the second of the Chachamim, the opinion that permits, that's more lenient about a shutter. And our question was, does he allow only a non-hanging scenario or even an untied scenario? Rav Yirmiyah says he allows all cases as long as it is Mesukan. I'm sorry. Rav Abba Rav Kahana says it could be untied and unhanging. Rav Yirmiyah says, no, it needs to be tied, but maybe not hanging. Maybe it's loose.
Oh, actually.
Hold on. Rav Yirmiyah brings a brisa which portrays the story of the Neger HaNigar precisely the way Rav Yirmiyah understands it. But Rav Abba brings another brisa, which also discusses an associated teaching of a Neger HaNigar. And over here, indeed, the opinions are beautifully correlated to the way Rav Kahana, Rav Abba, Rav Kahana taught the Mishnah. And so at this point, Rav Abba says we've got a beautiful brisa that supports our take of the halacha. Dr. Stamler, go ahead.
Yeah, so actually we see here that it goes back to the issue of designation, which is the machshava, rather than something that's tied up that you need an actual maaseh. You need, instead of, so basically it goes back to that issue.
No,
Whether
designation is always on our
whether
mind.
you need a deed, whether you need an actual deed to tie something, in addition to being designated, to show by deed that it's designated, or just be mesukan, just be designated by the mere thought.
Designated is a criteria, but it's not the primary issue at hand. It would be like if you're looking for a place to bank. I don't know why I'm thinking of this muscle, but there are certain criteria that are like baseline. A bank that doesn't insure up to whatever, that's not even a bank. But you're probably looking for a more important and more present issue like location or interest rate or I don't know, or number of branches or whatever. So like you have the issue that's really at hand, and then you have the bank. Of course, there's a baseline. So to handle something that can't be muksa, that's obvious. But the issue at hand is much more, let's say, fundamental or essential, which is the question of boina, if it's considered boina adjacent, a boina like act. So of course, when it's tied, when it's attached to the building, you don't even need a bavar in that. You don't even have to mention it because it's part of the building. But even if it's loose, it's a raw piece of material. As long as you are misaking it, again, taking a reading of how Taisa explained this previously, will say just with machshava, or maybe even it was manufactured, as Rebbeinu would like to say. It was cut to size, maybe.
Rabbi,
Yes.
a little off, a little detour.
Uh-oh.
I'm always amazed to what level of detail the Talmud seems to know what they did in the Beis Hamikdash. And here we have a thing. Why do we have a question whether it's allowed or not? We're supposed to know what they did in the Beis Hamikdash.
I understand your comment here. I don't think here's not where it really comes up. We're describing a halachic distinction between.
Just as an aside, because I'm always amazed that they know every detail of how it went several hundred
I've said
years
this before, but I'm going to say it again because it's very interesting. The Mishnah was transcribed and, let's say, published a long time after the Beis Hamikdash's destruction. The teachings of the Mishnah, however, did not appear with Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. The work that we call the Mishnah was really a compilation. The Mishnahs existed long prior. The teachings, the halachas, existed a long time before the Mishnah was finalized. The Mishnah were the formula, the way that these teachings were conveyed from teacher to student. The Rambam makes the point, which is important to consider, that although we call it an oral tradition, there were private pinkasim. There were, for internal reference, people had written down teachings. They just were not published or proliferated. They were a private work product of an individual student. And so although the Mishnah, as we know it, composed, edited, redacted by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, that doesn't mean that they did not have concurrent teachings that were from the time of the Mishnah. As a matter of fact, the Mishnah records many of the machloikis that occurred during the time of the Beis Hamikdash, because even when the Beis Hamikdash stood, it wasn't always enough to know what the protocol were, because the Sanhedrin had the ability and had the responsibility to determine halacha, and sometimes there would be a determination that was different than a previous determination. And so the protocols of temple ritual could change. And so just because there was a testimony about a specific mannerism in the Beis Hamikdash at a certain point, that would not be enough necessarily to establish the halachic practice. And I'm thinking of a very elementary example, that many times we have a machlokes of Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, or we have a discussion about the Bnei V'Seira and how to do a certain thing, and so or when Beis Shammai dominated the Sanhedrin versus when Beis Hillel dominated the Sanhedrin. And so your question is interesting, but I think the reality is a whole lot more nuanced. But that was not my point. The point that I wanted to make is that the Mishnah and the Tosefta and the Braisos preserve many debates between the Chazal, the Prushim, and the Tzedukim, the Sadducees. And for a very long time, you had to take it with faith because there was no evidence. And I've quoted this before, but I like to share it. Professor Lawrence Schiffman, who's one of the scholars of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and has a very distinct and educated take on it. I think in a world of scholars, he was, I think, initially one of the few scholars that were not just scholars of antiquities, but also a Talmud Chacham and knowledgeable of Mishnah and Gemara and Orthodox, I don't want to say Orthodox tradition, but Chazal tradition. And he did a very interesting series of studies and analysis, and he finds that there's a famous series of texts from the Dead Sea that were letters of the Dead Sea sect complaining to Jerusalem for their mismanagement of the temple. And they, as a matter of fact, it appears based on their writings that they originally were mostly Koyanim, or at least led by Koyanim, who were offshoots of the Tzedukim, the Sadducees. And they were disappointed about how the Beis Hamikdash was being run. And maybe they were hardliners and they couldn't handle having to cooperate with Chazal. And so there's a series of letters where they write very sharp rebukes to the temple, and these documents are preserved. And so what Professor Schiffman did is he went through the document, and almost all of them are intricate temple ritual complaints. And you could find one by one how each of those complaints, each of the unfavored behaviors are preserved in the Mishnah as the affirmative way to do temple ritual. And so you have a funny nuance in Paraduma that they didn't like. So they have, hey, you guys are doing it wrong. And then we have in the Mishnah how to do Paraduma. And the talks of how to handle Kalim and purity, because they were actually very machmir in Tumah and Tara, even more than Chazal. As we know, the Tzedukim, there were a number of practices where the Chazal would intentionally diminish or like do things that were kulas, but they would bedafke do it to show everyone that the halacha is not like the Tzedukim. So, for example, I think they would be mitama. They would cause ritual impurity to the kohen that were administering the. They would do a lower. Anyways, I don't remember the exact details. And so the point is, from our Mishnah alone, we would not know that that was actually the practice of the Mishnah. You have to have faith in the strength of an oral tradition. But what the Dead Sea Scrolls do, ironically, is they record and preserve and provide evidence to the accuracy of the Mishnah about a nuanced discussion that no one would know about and no one has known about besides for the Mishnah for 2,000 years. And so many people are perturbed. They read the Dead Sea Scrolls and they see that some of the things are different than Chazal, but you have to know how to see it. This was a quirky sect that nothing was good enough for them and they were willing to withdraw from the Beis Hamikdash. But even in their kefira, if you will, even in their anti-temple polemics, we can find evidence to the veracity and the authenticity of the Mishnah. And that, I think, is one of the biggest lesser-known chidushim of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And if you've heard it, you probably, even if you've never heard it elsewhere, I'm sure you've heard this from me before, but I wanted to share it because it's interesting. And Reb Beryl, I think it adds some perspective to your question. Would you agree?
Yes, obviously.
Bli Neder, one day I'll find the article, I'll find the paper, and we can explore it more in more detail. But I was by a conference where Professor Schiffman presented on exactly this issue, and so it's very, very interesting. All right, now that we've distracted ourselves, let's go back to our Gemara at hand. The Gemara at hand is really to try to figure out what the Mishnah means, bein kach or bein kach. The Chachamim are more lenient, and at the point of Rabbi Yirmiyah's challenge, we're pretty inclined to say, hey, bein kach or bein kach means it has to be tied, but maybe it's loose. But now Rav Abba pushes back and found the Brisa, which supports his viewpoint. That what? The Chachamim would be reflection of Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel's opinion. That even if it's bein kach, it's not tied. I'm sorry, it's not tight. Ubein kach, and even if it's loose, you could use it. That's Rav Abba and Rav Kana's take. And now Rav Abba has defended his thesis. What's the halacha? Amar Rav Yehuda bar Shelas, Amar Rav Asi, Amar Rav Yochanan. We have a teaching going back to Rav Yochanan to say, halacha kirabon Shimon ben Gamliel. The halachic practice, lemaisa, we paskin like Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. Wow. So in what regards do we paskin like Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel? Well, by the neger hanigrar, as long as it's pleasant and available, ready to be used, and you intend to use it, it doesn't have to be tied, it doesn't have to be hanging. And I imagine we would now apply, based on the teaching of Rabbi Yochanan, that the same halacha should apply to the pikak, and that's the interpretation of our Mishnah. Yochanan paskins like Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, and you would think that at this point we can close our Gemaras, or at least close out this discussion. But of course, the Gemara is after the truth, and the Chazal want to really dig deep and cross-reference and verify every statement that's possible. And so, we're not done yet. Gemara asks, Umi Amar Rabbi Yochanan Hachi, does this sound consistent? Does this sound like Rabbi Yochanan's voice? Is this the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan? Would Rabbi Yochanan really agree that a neger hanigrar would be allowed to use even if it's not attached? And here is where we're going to reintroduce a little bit of muksa talk. There's a brayso that says as follows. My dear friends, we're turning the page now to Kuf Chaf Vav Amud Beis. We have a brayso that says as follows: Kol Kisuye Hakelim, vessel covers. Sheyesh Lan Beis Achiza, if they have a handle, you told them it's Shabbos, they're allowed to be handled on Shabbos. They're not muksa. Amar Yehuda Bar Shela, Amar Abasim, Rav Yochanan v'hu sheyesh toiras kli aleim. When are we going to say that you're allowed to touch a cover that has a handle? It has to be considered a kli. Rashi. What does that mean? Shehakiso yiroi letashmish at letashmish. Atzma didn't tell me Shabbos. It has to be actually useful for something. Ain't teres kli Allah, but if it's not somehow considered kli, let's hold off on the details of the scenario. Lo yamrina and kisoi kli, lo yamrina and kisoi kli hava. We're not going to give the cover a status as a kli. The Dalta Shiva Teva Middle the Tana Masnis and Itolin. Yesh teres kli alayam the roin leishav alayam lasalayam is Lakatan or Lakama Farash on my bina base achiza. However, there's kli alayam Amar Becha immediately like a teres kli alav limit altlin. Okay. Basically, what do we see over here? We see one punchline, and this is what I wanted to show in Rashi. Alma, from this teaching, we know that Rabbi Yochanan says, Midi deleka toiras kli alav, a something that is not considered a kli halachically, loy metaltalin, and you cannot carry it. V'haikana, this read, my toiras kli alavika. What kind of keli is it? Imishum de poiseach v'noyel boy, ain't the toiras kli alav ela toiras bini. The fact that you use a reed to lock your door, that doesn't make it part of a kli. It makes it part of the structure. To be part of the structure, maybe it has to be attached. So how is Rabbi Yochanan going to be matter the reed? It's not a kli. It's not a kli because it's a raw piece of furniture that is used in the home. Let's continue reading for a moment. Maybe you'll answer. Maybe you'll answer. You know what? This reed is not entirely a raw piece of material. It can be used for other uses that would make it a kli. For example, Rashi says, maybe there are other uses that turn this thing from raw material to a reed. But still, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel doesn't need a teres kli. And Rabbi Yochanan is embracing, apparently, the opinion of Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. So we see an inconsistency. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says you don't need a teres kli. It doesn't need to be considered a kli to use. Rabbi Yochanan says you do. And so how do we find Rabbi Yochanan endorsing a viewpoint which we know is not his opinion? How do we know it's not his opinion? Here we see our old story, the palm branches. That were collected and used for wood, firewood. And in an Arab Shabbos, he said, you know what? This would be a wonderful chair for my Shabbos guests. The first opinion in the Brisa says you need to tie them. Machshava alone doesn't change their status. Doesn't make it into a kli. Shimon Gamliel says, Ein tzarich lekasher. There's no need to tie it. Why is there no need to tie it? Because it doesn't matter if it's a kli or not. If it's loose material, machshava alone makes an amuksa. Ein tzarich lekasher. Let's take a look. So now the Gemara answers, and this is the closeout of our teaching. Rabbi Yochanan severe lekavasei b'chada. You know what? Two people can agree on something without molding their entire world viewpoints to be identical. And so Rabbi Yochanan Sfira leikavasei bechada, upliga aleh bechada. Rabbi Yochanan agrees with Rabbi Shimon Gamliel in one sense and not in the other. How does he agree? The Mesukan v'afal pi she'enoi kosher. Rabbi Yochanan embraces the opinion of Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, that even if something is not attached, it could still be considered ready and designated for use in the building. But Rabbi Yochanan disagrees with Rabbi Gamliel. Because Rabbi Yochanan says, in addition to being Mesukan, it needs to be a kli. Whereas Rabbi Yochanan thinks it needs to actually be a kli. So Rabbi Yochanan can agree in the fact of the matter, in the halachic fact of our case, he can agree. And yet they can disagree about a very essential matter of muksa. So again, bottom line, in our case, in the Gemara, the item can, just so we get a punchline before we go on, Rabbi Yochanan Paskins, like the opinion of Rabbi Abba and Rabbi Kana, that it doesn't need to be attached at all. It could be loose, it could be untied, it needs to be misukan, it needs to be non-muksa, and in this regards, maybe there's a difference between Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, exactly the criteria to make it misukan. Maybe Rabbi Yochanan would say you'd have to actually have it more. Rabbi Yochanan, I'd say, is more like Rabbi Beryl's opinion. It has to actually be fixed up and precisely ready for a shutter. Maybe you have to be able to buy it in the store and it's called a shutter. Maybe. Whereas Rabbi Gamliel maybe is a little more flexible, that it could be a little bit more vague, ambiguous, or multi-purpose. It could be raw material, and yet if it was designated b'machshava, even if it's not a kli, you could use it. But as far as the essential question of our Mishnah, the essential question of the neger hanigrar, Rabbi Yochanan takes the more lenient opinion, the opinion of Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, the opinion of Rabbi Abba and Rabbi Kana. Now what we need to do, one more time, before we go on to the next part of the Gemara, is see how this is quoted in the Rambam. Very interesting. I want to scroll up a bit before I read this Rambam to you. I want to look for the Shulchan Aruch if he quotes here. Here we go. Join me in the Shulchan Aruch. Tiltul deles chaloin v'mino. The ability to carry, to use a deles, a door, a chaloin, and a kaka chaloin, the door, a shutter, kigayin luach, a shar kol davar, a board, or anything else, shesois memboya chaloin, which is used to close up a window. You can use it to close. You can use it, afilo meina kosher, even if it is not actually affixed to the structure. And the adding of this shutter on the building is not considered like you're adding to the building. Period. However, there's an important but. So long as you had in mind before Shabbos, to use it to close up the window. This is the case of the Pekaka Chaloin. So who do we paskin like? Rabbi Yochanan, Rav Kana, the second opinion, the Mishnah Chachamim. Again, I just want to show you. Halacha l'maisa, afilu im einai kosher. Even though it's not attached, you can use it. Now here's the big but. You do need to be misakin it. How do you misakin it? In the language of the Shulchan Aruch, it sounds like what Tosfos said. It's about your machshav, right? Because it says Vikana. What about our reed? The reed that was in the brisa that was presented to us by Rav Abba. You put it aside. You had in mind that you're going to use it as a lock, as a bolt. In Sorich, it doesn't need to be actually affixed to the door. It could be loose, like Rav Yochanan's psak, like the take of Rav Abba. There is a problem. There's something wrong with this reed that makes it a little more complicated than a pekak. It has a little bit more of a. It's more like a piece of building material than a kli. Therefore, how do you prepare? How are you mazmin? How are we misaken the reed? Machshava alone is insufficient. It's not enough to only have machshava. It needs to be misuken. How? The way Rashi explains our Gemara, you'd have to have in mind, if we just saw this in Rashi, you'll have to have in mind that it's going to be useful for additional uses, not only in the building, but also to flip olives or to crack nuts. It would have to be actually fit for an additional use. The Rebbeinu Tam says it doesn't have to be mamish good for another use, but you have to do something to alter it, and then that's enough. Does this sound a little bit like the machlokes of Reb Beryl and Dr. Hammer? About if you have to do a meiser if a machshava works? And so as you can see from here, there are times that we're more inclined to take the machshava route, and there are other scenarios where the item's a little more vague or not keli-like, and there you have to actually make some kind of effort. And so what do we see over here? This Shulchan Aruch so far, the teachings, the Shulchan Aruch as composed by the Beis Yosef Karo, is reflective of a halachic tradition that's following very strongly the viewpoint of Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan said, on one hand, it doesn't need to be attached. On the other hand, it needs to have toiras kli alav. This reed needs to be considered a kli, and therefore there has to be some super extra additional intervention than on other scenarios. Interestingly enough, the way the Shulchan Aruch learns, and this is based on earlier Rishonim, we would not apply exactly all of the same circumstances between Pikak and the Negar HaNigrar. The Negar HaNigrar has a greater weakness, let's say. Now let's read the Rama. Once you've made the modification, it's now a kli shemalachta leheter, and indeed you can carry it. Vinegar shehu yoset. Until now we're talking about a kana. A kana was the second brisa that was introduced by Rabbi Abba. What about this scenario of the first brisa? A bolt, shu yoset shanoyalim boy, which is a plank of wood that's used to lock. And you shove it into the, well, askufa I think usually means like the threshold, but you shove it in a way to block. Actually, you know the sliding doors? You put a pole behind the door, so that's not exactly the scenario, but over there you would actually put it to the askufa. The nagar, which is more building-like, whatever we've said previously is not enough, and you cannot tie with it. It has to actually be tied. So the Shulchan Aruch does, and he's really taking the earlier Rishonim here, is he's making sense of both brises that were presented in our Gemara, which seem like they're bistira. The two brises seem to be contradictory. The brise of the Negar HaNigrar, we said that it has to be tied. Right? We differentiate between if it's in the Beis Hamikdash or the rest of the country or the rest of the world. But the bottom line, the crux of that brisa was it needs to be tied. And then we said about a kana that it doesn't need to be tied. And we use that to apply halacha, of course, which was our original discussion to understand the pekak. So what about this negar? Well, here there's an additional problem. It's more building-like. Loy sagi b'hachi. Then you won't be able to use it on Kenya kosher. It has to actually be tied. Ketzad ye kosher. And how does it have to be tied? If it has the appearance of a kli, like a pestle, sagi, then it's enough. Even if it's nominally attached. You cannot use it. So if it's more keli-like It has to be tied, but it could be very nominally tied. But if it's not structured for another use, if it's on the door, it can be tied loosely. It's able to be tala. It doesn't need to be tala. But if it's attached not to the door, but to the part of the mechanism that secures the door, then it has to be a strong. And I'm gonna, and based on the Shulchan Aruch, which is again based on earlier Rishonim, I'm gonna revise my initial opening comments to Dr. Hammer. I have to revise my comments because in the beginning I said, "Oh, this is all about boina. It's all about building." Remember, not about muksa. Based on this reading and based on when we finish the Gemara, we learn all the brises and we see our Rabbi Yochanan Paskins and we see the issues that are raised by the other brisa. We must conclude that the tying is not exclusively about if it's already, or at least according to some ways of understanding the Gemara, it's not just about boina, but it's also a question of what makes this component handleable, what makes it not muksa. And when it's attached to the building, you can move a door. If it's attached to the building, it has to be strongly conceptually fused to the idea of its function on the building, or it would have to be a keli and not be muksa. So if it's keli, then there's more latitude. But if it's just a building component, it has to be more immediately attached to the structure. My dear friends, I think we're going to draw to a close here to allow us the opportunity to make a siyum on Monday. We're going to make a siyum on Monday on this perek, on the 17th chapter of Shabbos, and we're going to move to perek chai, mifanim. And Baruch Hashem, we are making good ground. Let us close out our study with a prayer.
Rabbi,
Hold on, we'll have comments. We're going to close out with a prayer
before-
for the good health and circumstances of the dear members of our Chabura and the Klal Yisrael. We should have a lot of good news. And days of the 3 weeks, days of mourning, we ask Hashem to transform our days of mourning to days of joy and celebration, the arrival of Mashiach Tzidkenu. And we'll find out who else is going to get Israel's greatest awards for accomplishments. Yon Navi should definitely be a contender. Rabbi Beryl, go ahead.
I sometimes wonder, and people question, why do they report all these different opinions and machlokas? Why not cut to the chase? But for me, one of the reasons would be that if they just gave you the bottom line, somebody would come and say, but had they thought of this, it would have been different.
Rebel, who says this? You're mechaven to very great people. I think the Rambam clearly says this, and others that discuss the formula of the Gemara and the Mishnah. They say absolutely. If we wouldn't have all the opinions, we wouldn't be able to take them under advisement. But now we have. No one's going to be able to claim that the wrong opinion didn't get airtime. Nobody considered it, and for whatever reason, one opinion or the other gets the halachic psak. So yashakayach. Alan.
Yes,
Good
sir.
Erev Shabbos.
Thank you.
Tell us something interesting to close out our